a Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History, and I'm remotely connected with the lovely, gorgeous Gary Bain, who's sat in luxury at home.
Yeah, very remotely, Peter. Anyway, how are you?
I'm good. So far. Don't worry if we cough a bit. It's just we've both got psychosomatic coughs today.
It's good to see you by video today. I can see all those books behind you. It reminds me of my book collection of yours, situated in my downstairs laboratory.
Yes, thank you very much for that opening remark. Salvo, I think we'll call that. As usual, I make the usual remarks that the sound on this will not be as good as it was when we were recording on a digital tape recorder in the same room. This is being recorded on the internet. And the other thing I'd point out is that today we're doing the French in 1914, which is a topic that means a lot to me. It really does, because I just think people don't really recognize how much of a contribution they made. In fact, it's not that they're making a contribution. They are the Allied war effort in 1914 on the Western Front. So we just want to talk about that, don't we? That's what we're doing today.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the struggle between them and the Germans is a titanic struggle. You can't underestimate the efforts that the French were putting in.
You can't. It's just, but I also... this book's based on stuff I did when I was writing The Great War, which is, and people always say, and this is where you say, not with me, you're not, I'm meant to be a popular historian.
Not with me, you're not.
So I'm not an expert. There are people who've spent a lifetime studying the French. Not often the French. It seems to be British historians a lot of it, but there's no doubt that the story needs to be told, and this is an effort by us to tell that story rather than a definitive account. Would you say that's about right, Gary?
I would, and I'd like to kick off, if I may, Peter, by asking you, pre-war, do you think that the Franco-Russian alliance of 1892 or Alsace-Lorraine did the most to sort of isolate Germany and lead to the events of 1914?
Well, I think I would go. The thing that really triggers it for me is 1870 and the Franco-Prussian War. And the French took on the Prussians, as they then were, alone, and got soundly thrashed. But then you have the complete failure of German diplomacy, and they allow the situation. It's almost like they don't understand. Perhaps it's the inability of the Kaiser to deal with Bismarck. Whatever it is, the total abrogation of any sort of sensible international diplomacy leads to them allowing the situation to drift, so that the French and the Russians form the alliance that you rightly alluded to in 1892. And then they go further. It's not enough for them to piss off the Russians and the French. They then manage to piss off the British as well by the Anglo naval race, which leads to the Entente Cordiale being in the early 20th century.
I think 1905, wasn't it?
Well,
Entente Cordiale.
I've forgotten.
I may be completely wrong.
So
what were the German plans then, Peter? So they saw all this going on. What did they do about it?
Well, they were already worried, but they could discern from the Franco-Prussian War that things were changing in warfare, because they'd won a couple of big battles, and in the past, you lost a couple of battles, and that was the end of the war. If you see what. But in 1870, the French, there was a provisional government, started raising a new army. From nowhere, if you like, i.e. from the general population. And this almost doubled the strength of the French army. And and the Germans had to deal with hordes and hordes of franc-tireurs, or what we call them resistance now, perhaps. The Germans called them, the Germans shot them. And they were harassing their communication lines. And it's quite interesting, the German first reaction to this new sort of warfare. And this is from the German chief of staff was General Helmuth von Moltke. And this man was quite hard. And he just decided that this was not going to be, he was going to, a fearsome reaction. He would crush all resistance, and eradicate the resources from which an army could spring. Not necessarily kill the whole population, but just destroy the barracks, destroy the infrastructure of military infrastructure. And when the French finally did sue for peace, Moltke wanted to carry on. But Bismarck, this is rare to see Bismarck in the role of peacemaker. Bismarck said, no, we'll have peace. And Moltke, the first Moltke, always regretted that. Always regretted it, because he always saw in the future this possibility, which their shit diplomacy ended up having to face, of the Germany would eventually have to fight France and Russia at the same time, and he made plans for such an eventuality, and they were largely just basically go on the defensive, but. You were a boxer, so largely defensive, but the occasional really vicious punch to try and catch the enemy, either France or Germany, unawares. And that was the case until General Alfred von Schlieffen became Chief of General Staff, 1892, about the time of the Russian thing, the Russian, Franco-Russian alliance. And he was desperate to avoid a lengthy war. Now, this business of a lengthy war is interesting. The Germans always knew they couldn't win a long war. If the war dragged on into years, they knew that eventually France and Russia would drag them down. This is before Great Britain had even got involved. They knew they couldn't win. So they were always out to avoid a long war. And Schlieffen came up with the plan. Now, you've probably heard of the Schlieffen plan.
I have. I've got a couple of questions about it, actually. So one of the questions is, it's always struck me that the plan, as I understand it, was to sort of delay things in the east, so delay the Russians, and invade France through Belgium and Luxembourg. I've always wondered why they didn't do it the other way round and simply just delay the French and attack the Russians, who, whilst there was a lot of Russians, were not... perhaps as respected in terms of their abilities in the field as the French.
Well, yeah, that's the temptation, isn't it? I mean, because the Russian army is in one sense weaker, but remember, one of the reasons we do history is to learn from the past. Yeah, that's what we're interested in. And if you think about it, this is only sort of 80 or 90 years out from Napoleon's invasion of Russia. And what had that taught people?
Oh, true. Yeah, good point. Good point, Peter.
The thing is, you push into Russia, how far do you have to go? So is it all over when you get Moscow? Well, actually, Russia goes a lot further on. And the thing is, there's limitless manpower now as well. So it's just, how do you beat Russia? How exactly? Now, you should never use examples from the future, if you see what I mean, but Hitler found the same problem. How exactly do you knock out Russia from a war if they don't surrender? Do you see what I mean? So Schlieffen recognized that, and he felt it wasn't possible to quickly overwhelm Russia. Do you see what I mean? So they couldn't have a long war. So they must overwhelm one or the other of France or Russia quickly. They couldn't quickly overwhelm Russia, so they went for France. They were going to have a knockout blow, as you described, against France, and they would hold back the Russians in the east.
And were they ready for that sort of in the early 20th century? I'm going to paraphrase now, but I've seen things that suggest that in 1912 they the Germans were concerned that the war might start too soon.
The Germans they had to get their preparations in place. There's a lot of people who say that the Germans were going to go to war in 1914 anyway. I don't want to get into the whole thing of how the First World War started. I am one of those who think the Germans are a lot to blame. However, the Russians, the French, and the British are not blameless. Those three countries are never, ever blameless, especially us. But there is this idea that, that, for instance, they had to dig the Kiel Canal so that they could have access, they could get out into the North Sea. There was lots of things to do. And the French, the other thing that the Schlieffen plan, the aspect that I'd forgotten, which we must raise, is that they weren't just going to go for the French first. They were going to go through Belgium and Luxembourg. Now, why invade neutral countries, especially a neutral country that was internationally guaranteed, including by the British? Now, Britain's word,
and indeed the Germans.
Indeed the Germans, yes, when they were Prussians, I think.
Yeah.
And so why go that way? Well, the answer to that was they have to beat the French quickly as well. The French had a line of fortresses all along the Franco-German border. We've been there, the Verdun ones. We've been to some of the other ones. Aren't they great fun? You can't ramble about them anymore, though. You get fined a huge amount. So listeners, don't ramble about those forts that aren't officially open. But those forts meant that to dodge them, they went up the top, and through Belgium and Luxembourg, where the border was not covered by forts. You might say, why not? Well, it wasn't.
Mm.
So that's the plan. So they would go sweep round through Belgium, then right through northern France, into northern France, and envelop the French armies, who they rightly presumed would be facing the German frontier, and that would allow the Germans to dictate terms. They could, French would be out of the war, and they could either secure Russia's surrender by threats, or turn on her and finish the Russians off. I suspect that's what they would have done.
And what were the French doing during this time? Because did the French have a plan too?
They did. They were preparing. They ramped up their conscription. 3-year law in 1913. Guess what that meant? 3 years. Conscription for 3 years. They had the fortresses that they'd been building since 1870, and they started to modernize the army. But modernizing an army is a big thing, Gary. It really is. You can't rush it. There's so much to do. But they started the process, and one thing they did improve was their logistical infrastructure. Now, I know from your career with Transport for London, you're interested in railways, and you understand above all how important that is. And one thing the French did was improve the railways, the communications to the frontier and laterally, along, so to move troops up and down France as well. And they improved the railways somewhere else. Can you guess where that was?
German border, presumably.
No, another country.
Oh, Belgium.
No, they spent a lot of money improving the Russian railway system. Why?
Oh, sorry, it's rather stupid of me. So that the Russians could actually assist them by attacking Germany, presumably.
As quickly as possible. Yeah. And the French are not fools in this manner. What are the French, lads? So the Germans are going to sweep round. What are the French going to do? Well, the French were relying on the promises of the Russians, firstly. The French are not fools. We keep this idea that the French are stupid in 1914. They knew that the Russians had promised to deploy around about 700,000, 800,000 men for an offensive into East Prussia within 2 weeks. So they were relying on that. But the French plans were based on the superiority of the offensive in comparison with the defensive. Now, how do you feel about it?
So is this the Elan thing? So it's
Elan.
one of the questions.
Sorry. Yeah. Oh, you're using a very romantic.
So one of the things in my mind, and again, forgive me, this may be just a romantic vision, is that the French went into the Great War, a 20th century war, wearing red trousers and blue tunics because, you know, they would be carried forward through the elan, the offensive, to victory. They didn't contemplate the defensive war that it ultimately turned into. Is that true?
It is true. They believed in the moral superiority of the attack. And people say, it's madness, machine guns, artillery, modern rifles, repeating rifles. That's just madness. But the thing is that they believed, and remember there'd been no European war to test it on, they believed that the concentration of firepower that could be generated would overwhelm the defensive troops. And people say, well, that's stupid. But what happened in 1918 with the all-arms battle? The firepower that the Allies, the British in particular, were able to generate against the Germans was such that they couldn't withstand it. It broke their morale, and they were able to surmount any obstacles. And that is what the French believed they could do in 1914. But the weapon systems were not up to the job. They didn't have enough of the right sort of guns, i.e. heavy guns, high explosive. They didn't have... they just didn't realise how deadly small arms and machine gun fire was.
But they did have some advantages, didn't they? I mean, the 75 gun, even today, is noted as an exceptional field artillery piece.
It is a fantastic rate of fire. I think it's a 16-pound shell in our archaic British don't understand. Every other country in the world has sensible things. We do it by the weight of the shell instead of the stupid inches of the gun. So there you go, British
millimeters.
Millimeters. Yes. It's a fantastic gun. It's a fantastic gun, but it's their main advantage, and they don't have the necessary heavy artillery, particularly if you think of the counter battery work. 75s are not great for counter battery work because the range isn't that great. They've got to be quite close to the enemy. Now, so let's see. So that's the whole thing. Only the offensive yields positive results is the quote I've written down there. But it's a gross oversimplification. But what they did, they wanted to take the lost provinces of Alsace-Lorraine. Now, if this was a well-organized podcast, I'd have mentioned that the Prussians had taken the two provinces of Alsace, the border provinces, off the French, which is why the French were never, ever going to make peace.
Yeah, but to be fair, Peter, we had mentioned that in a previous podcast, and were the French actually obsessed with recovering Alsace-Lorraine? So, just to be fair to you, we have actually discussed that in a previous podcast.
Well, I can't remember it, but then I remember very little at times. Now, the plan ran through various versions. It was owned by us, Roman numerals. So the one that Plan 17, XV11, it's not. Yeah.
How many were there before Plan 17 then?
I don't know. Well, I would have said 16, but knowing the military mind, I'd expect there was Plan 17, 16A, 16B, various variants. But let's just leave that joke where it is. Oh, I nearly swore. Thank goodness I avoided it. Now, Joffre, now the French commander was Joseph Joffre, and he was an interesting chap. He was an engineer. I think he was very bright. He was, the word is slightly overweight. And
rotund.
Rotund. I promise not to make any references to physical appearance anymore after Matt McLachlan told me off.
I thought it was McLachlan.
He'll kill
you. Morning, Matt.
Matt McLachlan, as we know him, Matt McLachlan, is our boss on Living History, isn't he? He loves us. Listen to his podcasts; they're great. That might get us off the hook there, Gary. Anyway, I forgot what I was talking about.
Joffre.
Joffre was stolid, perhaps slow thinking, but when he came to, he did consider what was going on, and he guessed the Germans would come through Belgium. But he asked the politicians, could he forestall this by invading Belgium first? And guess what they said, Gary?
No.
I think they would have deployed bad language. I think, they would. Do you think our listeners are aware of the expression WTF? I think that was what, and FFS. You may not understand these, but I think these are the thoughts that would go through the French politicians at the concept of forestalling a German invasion of Belgium by invading Belgium first. So anyway, so what they do is it was more of a concentration plan than anything else. They just placed the armies along the German, Luxembourg and Belgian borders. And then they would attack, pushing into Alsace-Lorraine. But they've got an option of deploying armies to counter the German forces if they did come through Belgium or northern France. The French, they too were thinking of a short war, but they had a bit... Sorry.
I was just going to say, in all these plans, was there any British involvement?
Yeah, yes, thank you. Yeah, and isn't it nice that I'd completely forgotten the British were involved at all?
Yeah.
Because that's about right, isn't it? At this stage of proceedings. The French were actually desperate to get the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, and they worked on the British politicians and the Director of Military Operations, which was Brigadier Henry Wilson, who you will remember. And they desperate to get them. And this is the quote we mentioned in our Mons podcast. Foch, General Ferdinand Foch, was asked as to the minimum effective size of the BF required, and he replied, "A single British soldier, and we will see to it that he's killed." Good old Foch. Yeah. And the idea is, of course, once the British are involved, they'll be involved. But in this stage of the war, the French knew the British were promising to send 6 divisions. In the end, they only sent 4. In the first instance, it became 6 after a month. But the point is that this is in a war of 60, 70, 80 divisions aside, and 4 divisions is neither here nor bloody there. What's more important is the Russian offensive into East Prussia. So look, should we get to the war after all this talking about?
Yeah, there's a war.
And there is a war, and I love the British perspective. When did the First World War start, Gary?
Well, over about 5 different days, as far as I can tell. That's it.
And you're not falling for 4th of August. That's when it started for us. It started. Germany mobilized, declares war on Russia. They invade that night. They invade Luxembourg, getting ready to drive into Belgium. And France and Germany were formally at war on the 3rd. And yes, we come in just a little bit later. So the 2 great competing visions of what's going to happen, the Schlieffen plan, which I can't pronounce, and Plan 17, which I can pronounce. That's why I'm siding with the French in this, because I could,
Yeah, well done.
Now, fully enough, the chap in charge of the Germans, the Chief of General Staff, was another von Moltke, but this is the younger. The elder had said, and you must know this quote, because I'm sure that even your captain in the army, your benighted captain, long-suffering officer in charge of you, would say, "No plan of operations extends with certainty beyond the first encounter with the enemy's main strength." I expect he spoke just like that, did he?
He was German, yeah.
Anyway, so the main thrust is the German 1st and 2nd armies. They're driving across the Belgian border, sweeping through the Belgian plains, and going deep into northern France. Next to them, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th armies advancing through Belgian Ardennes and Luxembourg and the French Ardennes, which is close, by the way, to Belgian Ardennes. And so 5 German armies are performing a gargantuan wheeling manoeuvre. Meanwhile, the German 6th and 7th armies, they're going to stand fast in Alsace-Lorraine. 68 German divisions are deployed on the Western Front. Superbly trained, not perfectly trained. Their cavalry was dodgy, some of their attack tactics, but their basic thing was they won the firefight and then launched an attack in open order, tightly controlled short bounds, dropping to the ground, when they came under fire and preparing for a possible counterattack after taking enemy positions. very similar to what we discussed at Mons, and contrary to the idea of massed formations, which is based on a picture of, everyone has in their mind that picture of Germans coming over a hill. That's actually manoeuvres. It's nothing to do with 1914.
And just to be clear, the French army, whilst not quite as big, but, something like 2.9 million in the French army, two massive, proper behemoths, I think, would be how you describe them, are going to clash.
Yeah,
that's the idea.
It's the Battle of the Titans, just like you said right at the start. This is the Battle of the Titans. The British, secondary. Brave, all the rest of it, but secondary. So on they go. So what happens? Well, they send a corps. French first send a corps to attack, driving in near the Swiss border into on the 7th of August, driving into Alsace. And General Joseph Joffre issues a stirring rallying call. And it was, "Children of Alsace, after 44 years of sorrowful waiting, French soldiers once more tread the soil of your noble country. They are the pioneers in the great work of revenge. For them, what emotions it calls forth, and what pride to complete the work they have made the sacrifice of their lives. The French nation unanimously urges them on, and in the folds of their flag are inscribed the magic words, right and liberty. Long live Alsace, long live France." Well, one corps.
And maybe slightly premature.
Yeah, just a bit. 9th of August, the German 7th Army counterattacks, 7th Army, and funnily enough, I'm just checking. Yes, it was the which corps? It was the 7th Corps, 7th Army. German 7th Army counterattacks and ejects them. Just imagine what it's like if you're one of those French Alsatian civilians who believed Joffre and sort of stuck the French flag up. You'd have to very quickly put the German flag up next day. Too small a force. The next thing is that a bigger attack, First Army and Second Army, would drive through the Vosges. Oh, I got that right. Vosges Mountains towards the Rhine. So First Army and Second Army. I'm going to name the generals because you've never heard of them. General Auguste de Bail, and you might have heard of this one. That's First Army. Second Army, General Edouard de Castelnau. Now, the thing I want to make the point is, why haven't we heard of these generals? Why have we heard of a poxy corps commander in the British Army or a divisional commander like Snow? Dan Snow's grandfather.
Yeah.
Why have we heard of them, but we haven't heard of army commanders of the French?
Well, I have heard of de Castelnau, actually.
Yeah.
But one of the questions is, were they up to the job? There was a lot of backbiting going on in all of the armies. That Joffre was not perhaps as popular with some of the generals as he might have been. And there is a question, were they up to the job? I think subsequently quite a lot of them were sacked.
Oh, they were. And they're not up. Some of them aren't up to the job. They definitely aren't. Their performance is weak. They're facing the German 6th Army, that's Crown Prince Ruprecht, and the 7th Army, General Josias von Heeringen. I'm not sure about that, how you pronounce it. And they fell back in front of the main French advance, fighting a classic delaying battle, not committing too many infantry units and using their guns, the artillery, to inflict casualties on the advancing French. Now, the French are in trouble there. Yeah, sorry?
I think that was exactly as they were ordered, wasn't it? It wasn't that the French were pushing them back. They were fighting in the manner that they were ordered. I think later Prince Ruprecht goes off at a tangent, but he does. He was following orders.
At the start, because the French have got terrible problems. They're going through difficult terrain, the Vosges Mountains, that area. Some of them, they're on wide fronts. They've got different generals, and that's the point you made. Different generals who perhaps don't cooperate quite as well as it. They're not perhaps used to cooperation rather than showing themselves in the best light. They didn't understand the importance of having tactical reserves. And our talk on Mons, Sir John French also didn't understand any concept of that. And they, and this is where it all goes wrong though for the Germans, because the French attack's failing. And what does Ruprecht do? Have a guess.
I think he he's begging his superiors to unleash him, as he sees it, into the attack.
He does. And Moltke, the junior, he gives way. Now, I think Schlieffen, someone like that, would have said, knack us to it. Obey your orders and do what you're told. But Moltke just sees it as an opportunity. 20th of August, the Germans launch a really big counterattack because against the second, it's called the Battle of Morhange. The French are outranged, their artillery are outranged, the German guns are better, and they get heavy bombardments and they start to fall back. And that uncovers the flank of the First Army, and they all tumble back, right back to the start lines. But then Ruprecht continues to attack. Now, why might that be a problem?
Well, I think largely because he is actually at that point following his own path. And the more he attacks, the more he exposes to a counterattack. And he's also, this is for our good friend, Mr. Thompson, he's extending the lines for the logistical support. And actually, he's going to be pretty much on his own at some point.
So he's pushing forward. And, of course, the French drop into improvised defence lines, trenches.
Yeah.
And then the Germans are attacking, and they keep attacking these French lines because these are the first, no first trenches in the Great War, but these are early trenches, and they batter themselves. They're battering themselves against a brick wall of the French lines, and
that's interesting because I thought that the first trench systems were at the Ain in September. So you're telling me that was much earlier.
First British trenches. They also had trenches at Mons, but not improvised trenches. But yeah, it's the British perspective dominating history of the Great War at times. We should think before we speak. And anybody who ever says, "Oh, first trenches were on the Ain," first British trenches, possibly, and not really. We have this one-eyed perspective. The French dug in and they held back the German offensive. They sucked in manpower and they turned Ruprecht's victory into a bloody millstone round his neck because he was losing men, and those men, should the war go on, would be important later on. But the big plan, let's go on to the Ardennes offensive. This was in the Metz-Thionville area by the 3rd, 4th and 5th Army. They would drive, the French 3rd, 4th and 5th Army would drive into the lower Ardennes, and that would start on the 22nd of August, while the 5th French Army would sort of move to hold the two German armies.
And can I just point out at this point that this is the dates now are starting to coincide with the British actions and engagements around Mons. We're getting to the similar time period now.
We are. This is the 26th, it's the day before Mons, Yeah. And so we're moving forward at this point towards Mons, the British. The 4th Army, again, I'll name them because we should remember them. It exposes me to not being able to pronounce their names, but General Fernand de Langle de Carey, 3rd Army, General Pierre Ruthi, and they'd meet the German 5th Army, Duke Albert von Württemberg, and the 5th Army, Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm. And there's a titanic series of encounter battles in the Ardennes on the 22nd of August. It's unbelievable. They're incredibly bloody. It's in woody hill. The Ardennes. It's not
great. It's not great for any sort of fighting. It's going to be very difficult terrain.
It is, and not helped by fog. So you get ambush, all sorts of things. And when the Germans advanced, when the French advanced, I do apologise. They found the Germans dug in, not trench system, such as, but they sort of dug in at the forward edge of thick woods, so that you'd have to advance across an open area into a field of fire. Now, I just want to go. One division, 3rd Colonial Division, the French attacked at Rossignol, and 6 battalions attacking entrenched German troops. And this is one quote. We're going to have a couple of quotes now, because I think this is the best way. We can talk place names that you and I could probably not find on the map. Let's be absolutely honest with ourselves. If I name Rossignol, you could put your finger on the map on it now. No, but we understand it's in the Ardennes, lower Ardennes. But do you see what I mean? Where is it?
Yes, we could probably do it.
It'd have to be a big finger and a small scale map. I knew. But this is Captain Ignard, 1st Regiment of the Infantry, Colonial Infantry, 3rd Colonial Division. This is what he says. Forward the 7th, fix bayonets. I entered the woods as ordered. We moved quickly. We can hear the bugles calling. It lifted the men. They were a superb sight. All going well so far, Gary? Yeah. Well, the wood was thick, and as the sections advanced at varying speeds, I could no longer see all of my company. The charge faltered under rapid fire at close range from the enemy sheltering behind earthworks. We officers and their distinctive headdress, because they didn't have covers on, or did they have covers? It might be the other way. See, there, not an expert, forgotten. Made us obvious targets. A bullet hammered into the top of my left arm. The shoulder was shattered. My arm left hanging only by pieces of flesh. I fell, half fainting. Rossignol is a terrible slaughter, and Ignard, he's badly wounded, but he's lucky. Do you know how many casualties in one division? 4,083. 4,083 were killed from the 3rd Colonial Division, say about 18,000 men in all, 12,000 infantry. Total losses that day, 10,500 killed, wounded and taken prisoner, out of total 15,000, say, in the 3rd Colonial Division. Do you understand? So nearly 4,000 killed out of 15,000.
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned before the losses of the French in a previous podcast, and I'm paraphrasing, forgive me if I get this wrong, I think 27,000 in a single day.
It is right.
But I think this is more shocking. 10,500, I appreciate casualties, but that's 2/3 of the 15,000 strength of that division.
It's unbelievable.
2/3.
And 1/3 are dead. 1/3 of the total. I mean, anyway, here's another quote. This is from Major Alphonse Grasset, 103rd Regiment, Infantry Regiment. My company was sustaining heavy losses. Evidently, its action was hampering the enemy, who concentrated listen to this, combined fire of his infantry, artillery, and machine guns on us. This is combining the fight. We were surrounded by a heavy cloud, which at times completely veiled the battlefield from our eyes. Little Bergeret sprang up, shouted, "Vive la France!" at the top of his voice. The elan. I wonder what will happen to him, and fell dead. See what I mean? Yeah. The wounded offered a truly terrible sight. Sometimes they would stand up bloody and horrible looking amidst bursts of gunfire. Heart-rending cries, agonizing appeals, and horrible groans were intermingled with the sinister howling of projectiles. One man was trying to replace his bloody dangling hand to his shattered wrist. Another ran from the line holding the bowels falling out of his belly. Before long, a bullet struck him down. Here's another important bit, Gary. We had no support from our artillery. And yet there were guns in our division and in the Army Corps, beside those destroyed on the road. Where were they? Why didn't they arrive? We were alone. Now, why didn't they arrive? And this is the question, because First World War was all about artillery. We all know that. Well, they were not as well trained and effective. I mean, they didn't have the big training grounds to practice as much. They didn't know where their own infantry was, so they didn't know where the German infantry was, so they didn't know where the targets were. Artillery can't open fire when it doesn't know where its own troops and the enemy troops are. And they were often caught in open fields. Carry on, Gary, sorry.
Well, one of the things I was going to say is I'm just going to emphasise how difficult it would be to control armies of that size, including, corps of those armies. The actual, how do you practice, how do you manoeuvre in peacetime armies of that size? You can't do it.
You just practice as best you can, and the Germany's a bigger country. It had more space to practice. And some elements like their fake cavalry charge that the Kaiser would lead or watch, at the end of each blasted thing, that was fake and useless. But the French just weren't. And this is a quote from one of the gunners. And this is so where are the gunners? And there's always this perception of bloody gunners let us down. But this is gunner Paul Lintier. He wrote a famous book, 11th Battery, 44th Regiment of Artillery. And he says, near the crest of the hill, we took up our positions on the edge of an oat field, crouching behind the armoured doors of the ammunition wagons and behind the gun shields. We awaited the order to fire. But the captain, kneeling down among the oats in front of the battery, his field glasses to his eyes, could discover no target. all around us without respite. High explosive and shrapnel shell of every caliber kept bursting and strewing the position with bullets and splinters. Death seemed inevitable. So the gunners were fighting, but they were fighting ineffectually. Do you see what I mean? In other words, they're not fighting, they're just suffering. So it's not just the infantry suffering, but of course, each arm has its own perspective. So to the French infantry, where's the bloody gunners? The gunners, ow.
Yeah.
So I've got, I think the 27,000, I've got a quote now that, we believe that military history should be enjoyable and interesting, but there are moments when it isn't enjoyable. It's almost hard to listen to, say, a quote that uncovers the horror of war. And this is a quote from Lieutenant Maurice Genevois, 106th Regiment of Infantry. And he said, this quote's heartrending, and it also shows that no matter how brave you think you are, when you really hit in action, you react like most people, and that is, if you're not crying for your mother, you're crying for help. And this is Genevois. And he says this: these shouts, these plaintive cries, these moans torment all those who can hear them. Drink! Are we going to let me die here? Stretcher bearers, drink! Stretcher bearers. I hear one man say, yes, what the bloody hell are they doing, the stretcher bearers? Before us, the dark shadow seems to groan with all the wounds that bled and were not dressed. Faint voices, weary from crying out. What have I done to get killed in this war? It's quite heartrending. Mother, oh mother, I'm thirsty, I'm thirsty, I'm thirsty, I'm thirsty. The cries appall us, they cut us to the quick. I don't want to die here. Oh God, stretcher bearers, stretcher bearers. And then the bit that brings back an edge of humour, but dark, macabre humour. Bastards! Is there no one with any pity? And it's not funny, is it? It's just, I think that quote's quite, I don't know. It's just horrible, isn't it? And that's the aftermath of battle. And can you imagine 27,000 dead and all those wounded? It's just awful, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I would say at this point, I have some friends who sort of denigrate the French and their performance in the Great War. I think cheese-eating surrender monkeys is a phrase that I've heard I don't agree with. And this just puts that lie to shame. I mean, there are acts of heroism. They're extremely brave. They're fighting hard. I mean, they are fighting very, very hard at this point.
They are. And I could do no better. I could do no better than quote someone you've heard of, Gary. Lieutenant Charles de Gaulle.
Never heard of him.
But this man, you can be as brave as you like. You can have sang-froid under fire. You can be a bloody hero. But this is what happens to you in reality. And this is what Charles de Gaulle's future, is he president of France or was he prime minister? President.
He was president.
He said this: suddenly the enemy's fire became precise and concentrated. Second by second, the hail of bullets and the thunder of shells grew stronger. Those who survived lay flat on the ground amid the screaming wounded and the humble corpses. With affected calm, the officers let themselves be killed, standing upright. Some obstinate platoons stuck their bayonets on their rifles. Bugles sounded the charge. Isolated heroes made fantastic leaps, but all to no purpose. In an instant, it had become clear that not all the courage in the world could withstand this fire. And the end result, 200,000 casualties during the Battle of the Frontiers. 75,000 dead in these 2 or 3 days. 75,000. The British go on and on about the Battle of the Somme, and quite rightly so, nearly 20,000 dead in a day. But this puts it in perspective. It doesn't diminish the British loss on the Somme on the first day, but it puts it in perspective. So what's happening with the rest? Let's move on. The Schlieffen plan, what's happening to that? Well, the German General Alexander von Kluck, and that's First Army. Second Army, General Karl von Bülow. Third Army, General Max von Heusen. All that's facing them is the General Charles Lanrezac and his French Fifth Army. And people keep saying, why didn't Lanrezac help the British at the Battle of Mons? Jesus wept. He's facing three armies.
Might have been a bit busy.
He was busy. He had 15 divisions facing 38 divisions of the German 2nd and 3rd Army. Von Kluck's 1st Army was facing the British. The British were outnumbered. The Battle of Mons, we've discussed this. I urge people to listen to our podcast on that. We didn't do great. Battle of Le Cateau. Now, I know we slightly differ on this, and we'll be exploring this in a podcast about Le Cateau, because Smith Dorrien's a bit of a hero of yours, and with me, he's slightly less so, still a hero. But after Le Cateau, the bloody nose we gave the Germans, in truth, the French thought we were beaten, because what happens after Le Cateau is we fall back into pell-mell retreat, the Great Retreat, as we call it, because we have a way with something's gone badly wrong.
A glorious retreat. Yeah.
What do we call it? Do we call it the humiliating retreat, or do we call it the Great Retreat? Oh, let's go for that. The Germans, their cavalry perhaps at fault, but they didn't realise which way they were going. And the denouement, because you'll notice I'm accelerating, but I think this is an impression of the French in 1914, not a bloody history of it in total. The denouement of it all is the Battle of the Marne. So here, General Joffre stands proud. I was going to say erect and proud, but I know that would just get you to make some sort of remark. So,
I was going to ask, actually, the Battle of Marne, who was responsible for that? Is that Joffre's baby, for want of a better word? Because he got a lot of criticism, didn't he, from Galliani, I think.
Oh, Galliani. Galliani was in charge of the Paris forces around there. Galliani, of sure, taxes, blah, blah, blah. But for me, the person who would have had the blame if anything gone wrong, the person, in my view, with his staff, because like all generals, staff are providing, they may even have provided the original idea. But for me, Joffre is the man that pulls it all together. Firstly, he says, he works out that the French are fighting in the wrong manner. And here's a quote from him. I can't do French accents. He says, "It was apparent that the principles of the offensive, which we had tried to inculcate in the army before the war, had often been poorly understood and badly applied. I was told that advance guards, through a false comprehension of the offensive spirit, were nearly always sent into action without artillery support, and occasionally got caught in close formation under the enemy's artillery fire." So that's the first part. They'd gone over the top with the offensive action. They'd gone in without artillery. They hadn't sorted things out, and they'd been caught. The second thing was he launched a cull of generals. Anybody who wasn't up to the job was sacked. And here's what he says. Now, I have the highest respect for some academics, but I love the fact that he actually has a little go at academics here. He says this: "A large number of our generals had shown that they were not equal to the task. Among them were some who in time of peace had enjoyed the most brilliant reputation as professors. There were others who during map exercise had displayed a fine comprehension of manoeuvre. But now, in the presence of the enemy, these men appeared to be overwhelmed by the burden of their responsibility. In some of the larger units, there had been a complete abdication of command. Anybody too timid, too old, too stupid, too slow, old, useless." I'm describing myself here.
Yeah, I would add stubborn to that list.
Yes. I'm not sure I'm stubborn. I'm going to stand firm and say I'm not stubborn. I'm not. Right. Anyway, but the one thing that Joffre conceives of a plan. And his plan is basically, as von Kluck comes marching round, he's meant to sweep round Paris, but he turns inside of Paris. So he turns south before he's meant to go right round to the west of Paris, but he doesn't. He comes east of Paris. And that presents a possibility with the rail communications, Mr. Railway Management Executive, former, but, that using the rail, they could move the people from the rest of France to make an army on the right flank of von Kluck's First Army as he comes past Paris.
So this is the Sixth Army, isn't it? Which in itself, the creation of the Sixth Army is quite remarkable, really, given everything that's going on.
It's an amazing feat, and it's entirely reliant on railways, and the railway lines that go up north-south as well as east-west. Now, there was one, Joffre had a plan for the British. And this is one of my favourite quotes of all time. He has to deal with the British, and he has a chat with, he meets Sir John French. And this is Joffre's account. So Sir John French has his own version of events, but I have to say I believe Joffre. And Joffre says, the British Commander-in-Chief started out immediately in a rather excited tone to explain that his army had been violently attacked. He explained to me that since hostilities had begun, his troops had been submitted to such hardships that he could not for the moment contemplate resuming the offensive. More than once, he made complaints concerning the manner in which the Fifth Army, that's Lanrezac, his neighbour, had acted. He accused this army of having broken off the fight and left him completely isolated. In reply, I said to the Field Marshal that you can imagine him using this patient voice as used by a teacher to a recalcitrant 4-year-old, that all the Allied troops, without exception, had been pushed hard by the enemy, and that he must not suppose the British army was the only one which had suffered from the severe conditions of the campaign. Now remember, they've just had 27,000 dead in a day. I feel humiliated for the British on their behalf by French's attitude, by this behaviour.
Well, there are echoes of the Britain of today, aren't there, really? Attitude. It's all about us.
It's all about us. Exceptionalism. We're not part of a bigger team. I mean, this is what's going on, isn't it? I'm not going to say Brexit because that would, bring an unwelcome air of politics into it. So I will definitely not mention Brexit.
I will mention Brexit.
So Joffre said, this is his words, my own preference consisted in creating on the outer wing of the enemy a mass capable in its turn of enveloping his marching flank. So that's exactly what we described. He's coming swooping round von Kluck, and he's going to hit him where the elbow is, if you see what I mean, if it's an arm making a gesture. Now, the French considered the BEF wasn't pulling its weight. It was actually retreating faster than the Fifth Army on its right, and it's got the Sixth Army being created on its left. But he actually orders Lanrezac, the Fifth Army, to counterattack to relieve pressure on the faltering BEF. This is completely different from our British perspective, isn't it? But meanwhile, guess who else is having trouble at this stage of the campaign? Can you think who else might be having trouble?
Well, the Germans must be by this stage.
Yeah. And General Alexander von Kluck, don't buy his memoirs. He is a turgid bastard. God almighty, I've never read so. Jesus wept. Oh, geez. Anyway, he says, but he's completely right. The First Army had now completed 2/3 of the wheel through Brussels on Paris. The requirements of the strategic situation made it impossible to give any rest days in the true sense of the word. Marches and fights, battles and marches followed one another without interval. The infantry were marching 15 to 20 miles a day. That's a long way, carrying all your kit. It's physically exhausting, never mind fighting the various people there, to British, anybody else, So, as von Kluck turns inside of Paris, he exposes a naked flank to the newly created French Sixth Army.
How were the Allies aware of this development? How did they become aware that he'd actually turned his flank?
Great point. And again, referring to our previous podcast, this is the aviation services of both countries. We like to think it's the Royal Flying Corps, and do listen to our 1914 Air War, because that barely mentions the French. So I'm going to mention now the French Air Service was also providing incredibly useful reconnaissance, so that they knew what von Kluck was doing. They fly over and see him. This is aviation at its best, and by now people were listening to him. However, one more. Let's go back to Sir John French. And my favourite quote of this whole talk, we're getting quite near the end. This is, they met Field Marshal Sir John French and Joffre. And this is Joffre's account. And it has the ring of truth, doesn't it? Especially the last bit. This is Joffre speaking. He's trying to persuade French to take part in the Battle of the Marne. French, the general, the British Army. I put my whole soul into the effort to convince the Field Marshal. I told him that a decisive moment had arrived and we must not let it escape. We must go to battle with every man both of us had and free from all reservations. Then, as I finished, carried away by my convictions and the gravity of the moment, I remember bringing down my fist on the table. I hope you heard that. Which stood at my elbow and crying, Monsieur le Marshal, the honour of England is at stake. Jesus wept. I'm just saying, can you hear what he's saying? Do you not feel almost embarrassed for us? Up to this point, Sir John French had listened imperturbably. Without emotion. Thank you. To the officer who was translating what I said. One problem. What is it there? British French, can't speak each other's language. What I said. But now his face suddenly reddened. There issued a short, impressive silence. Then, with visible emotion, he murmured, I will do all I possibly can. Not understanding English, I asked Wilson, that's the same Henry Wilson, what Sir John had said. He merely replied, and this is the computer says yes joke. The Field Marshal says yes. And then my favourite bit of the quote, tea, which was already prepared, was then served. Both have a little drink there. Cheers. And you know, how do you judge whether something's true or not? Because French's account bears no
little touches like that, you know, tea being served, so typically British.
I think
that has the ring of truth to it, doesn't it?
The Battle of the Marne, the Sixth Army, the French Sixth Army hammers into the right flank of von Kluck. The British BEF is sent into action, and it and French divisions march into the gap between the German First and Second Armies. There's a chasm opening between von Kluck and von Bülow, the Second Army. The French Fifth Army, the BEF, they move into the gap. No great battle in some ways. The Battle of the Marne in some ways is a manoeuvre battle. You know, there's no huge fight. Of course, there is fighting, but, you know, if they stay where they are, the first and second German armies are going to be destroyed. They have to fall back. And on 9th of September, von Moltke, the German chief of staff, orders them to retreat back to the Aisne River. Now, this is a stunning strategic victory for the French. And we sometimes present it as the British advanced into the gap and created it. That's not what created this. What created it was Joffre's creation of the Sixth Army. The Fifth Army was alongside us advancing into the gap. The British play a small, but in my view, significant, but small. And small is the first thing, role in the Battle of the Marne. Battle of the Marne is a stunning victory. I give the credit not to Galliani, who saw some of the opportunities, but to Joffre, who would have taken the blame and who's the man who organised it. Galliani didn't organise the troops coming from the rest of France to join in that Sixth Army. That was, you know. And what we find then is all along the front, the Germans fall back, dig in on the Aisne, on the ridge at the top of the Aisne, and all along the front, it's stabilising. And you can tell who's won. How can you tell who's won a battle? There's one very simple way. What's that, do you think? It's just throwing it.
Thanks very much for that. I mean, it's what's the objectives of the Germans? The Germans have not achieved their objectives. They are now having to fall back onto their supply lines, and now they're on the defensive. Their whole plan was an offensive plan.
To win the war quickly. Brilliant. Yeah. That's it. Had they done that?
No,
had they won the war?
No, and thank you for giving me a heads up that you were going to ask me that, Peter. Cheers.
Always there to help you, Gary. Always there to help you. The point was, do you know, I think I'm not alone in thinking that this is a decisive battle of the war. You know, no great fighting, but it is the beginning of the end for the Germans. They're not going to win the war quickly. And what did the Germans think would happen if it was a long war? Germany would be destroyed. So in some ways, the Germans have other chances, but this is incredibly important. The Battle of the Marne is an enormous victory. And one way of telling is what happens to the German Chief of General Staff, General Helmuth von Moltke. He's sacked.
Replaced by Falkenhayn, isn't he? I think
that's right, Falkenhayn. Who, by the way, is a fantastically interesting character. It's the only thing I disagree with Jack Sheldon on. He thinks he's an idiot. That means I'm probably an idiot. But Jack Falkenhayn is fascinating. I urge people to read about him. Fantastic.
And presumably in a future podcast, we'll be doing Verdun and
definitely
touching on Falkenhayn in that podcast. Presumably
we will, and I think Jack's probably right about Verdun, but I think Falkenhayn is just good. Falkenhayn knew we were going to use the war, knew they were going to change sides there for a moment. Did you notice that?
Yeah.
So Moltke had failed to carry out the Schlieffen plan. The Schlieffen plan is is it a plan? It's sort of, there is this argument as to whether there was actually ever a Schlieffen plan and whether it was just something the Germans were going to do. There's no detailed plan ever, and I'm not interested in that argument, I have to say.
And whatever it was, it's dead now. It's finished.
It's finished. And what happens then? I'm not going to talk much about the rest because I think we've set the scene. The scene is the French have won the 1914 campaign. And what happens then is the Battle of the Aisne. We think that's a British battle. Do you think that's a British battle?
No, I think that's largely a French battle again.
The French are on both sides of the British, playing a crucial role. Race to the sea. Is that the British racing the Germans?
Well, I think, one of the least known things is that we weren't alone at Ypres, for example, that the French were at Ypres. So I think the race to the sea, again, is largely the French. We do play an important part. I'm not denigrating the part we play.
And the Indian division arrives. And some of our territories take place. But it's like it's still mainly the Germans and French. They're the people. It's like one of those huge boxing matches between heavyweights, not sort of welterweights like yourself, but where they're sort of smashing into each other. And they can't quite beat each other, but and they're just hammering hell out of each other. And the logistic, can you imagine? Now, this is from Rob Thompson, the international expert, in my view, on logistics, and a lovely man. Can you imagine the logistical problems of the race to the sea? Moving units, because what's happening is they're trying to outflank each other. It's not a race. They're trying to outflank each other. The sea's the last thing they want to get to. They're trying to get round each other. And so they sort of and each time they sort of go, we'll get round this time. And they meet the other. So they'll try again further to the north. And they try again. And they try again. And the last one, as you mentioned, is Ypres. Ypres, at first, it's mainly the British. But then, if you look at the map, there's a series of maps in the official history. The British originally are most of the defence of Ypres, what became the Ypres salient. And then the angle narrows and narrows and narrows as the French divisions come in. Who's in overall charge of the Battle of Ypres? Is it Sir John French or Sir Douglas Haig? No, it's Foch, actually, Ferdinand Foch.
Yeah, Ferdinand Foch.
And so, and he proves a perfect ally. He works brilliantly with Haig, less well so with French, of course, French. But in the end, yes, the British played a fantastic role in throwing the Germans back at Ypres. But it's just as much, if not more so, the French. The other thing is, remember we said the Germans had used up their a lot of their manpower attacking when they shouldn't have done. Ruprecht had attacked when he shouldn't have. Was it Ruprecht? I can't remember already. He'd attacked when he shouldn't have done, and minced up a lot of German men. That's a horrible term. It's because you mentioned Verdun. Minced up a lot of men. Well, now they're desperate for men, and they send in not school kids, but they send in a lot of very new troops, not properly trained troops. And this is the slaughter of the innocents. The Germans lose terrible casualties at first Ypres. And then we go into the winter campaign. And I think so what happens in the winter? The British perspective.
Well, as you get towards Christmas, you have the Christmas truce and Silent Night and the infamous football match, which didn't happen. And I presume at all this time the French were quite busy.
The French were busy. I think the British have the odd. I think there's a brigade attack, and I've forgotten. I think it's 17th of December. Can't remember. But they have a brigade attack or two. What are the French doing? Oh, the French are surrender monkeys. No. The French are launching major attacks. 17th of December, the 10th Army in Artois. They're trying to capture Vimy Ridge and push through onto the Lens Douai plain. A massive attack by not a brigade, an army. The second French offensive, Champagne area, 20th of December. 4th Army attacking along a 25-mile front. 258,000 troops backed by 700 guns. That's almost the scale of the first day of the Somme. The French launch into this series of attacks, trying to break the German army. Unfortunately, what they thought would be a devastating artillery bombardment, it's just, as we now know, the Germans are in trenches. You need a lot more guns than that. And they have awful casualties throughout December, stretching into mid-January. There's no easy way to victory, the French discover. But again, I want to let's juxtapose it. Brigade attack, Christmas truce. There's some truces on the French front. But for the most part, in Champagne and Artois, as would be the case throughout 1915, the French are knocking bloody hell out of the Germans, and the Germans are knocking bloody hell out of the French. This is the real titanic continental warfare. The British role in 1914 is insignificant.
Thank you very much, Peter.
There's not much else to say, is there? Thank you for all your help and support in these difficult times. Cheers,
Thanks,
Gary.
Peter.